Hello everyone, my name is Matt Backhouse. I'm the head of Stray Animal Care, Southeast Asia at Four Paws International, and I'm grateful and honoured to be speaking here today at this ICAM online conference about dog population management. It's been such a great event so far, so many interesting presentations and speakers, and I'm grateful and honoured to be invited to speak, so thank you for that. So today, just before Ellie brings the event to a close, I'm going to spend a little while talking about the dog and cat meat trade in Southeast Asia, the implications for rabies control and population management. Every year in Asia, more than 30 million dogs and cats are captured, killed, and eaten across the continent. In Southeast Asia, more than 10 million animals are killed for their meat every year, making it arguably one of the most serious issues facing companion animals today. I also need to give a warning that there may be some images in my presentation which some people find upsetting, so my apologies in advance for that. The dog and cat meat trade raises a number of ethical and practical considerations that need to be talked about when looking at rabies control and dog population management programs. This presentation will look at some of the major issues regarding the dog and cat meat trade, how it can impact rabies population programs, and also some other ethical considerations which must be discussed when considering ending dog and cat meat trade in the countries where it exists. So first of all, I'm going to start by identifying the countries where Four Paws is working and which will be the subject of our presentation today. So in Southeast Asia, Four Paws works in 3 countries: Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. In Cambodia, more than 3 million dogs a year and an unknown number of cats are killed for their meat. In Indonesia, it's 1 million dogs per year, and in Vietnam, 5 million dogs and 1 million cats every year are killed for their meat. Many of these animals are pets which are stolen from their homes, or own stray roaming dogs which are caught and taken to be killed. As we'll see throughout the presentation, this is one of the principal issues that needs to be discussed when talking about population management programs. So let's look now at something which I'm sure you will all recognize, which is the dog population dynamic graphic from the ICAM website. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this graphic, as many of us here have been working in dog population management programs or very experienced in the area. The reason to include it is that I'm making the argument that many of the animals that we see here on this graphic can end up in the dog and cat meat trade. Pet theft in the dog and cat meat trade is extremely high. Owned confined animals, owned roaming animals are frequently stolen and traded and killed for their meat. In other countries, we often see that owned roaming, owned lost, unowned, and community-owned animals are frequently stolen, trapped, caught, or even sometimes willingly traded in exchange for pots, pans, and other goods in impoverished and rural communities. The reason to mention this population dynamic is that in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, not just death or removal from the streets to holding and rehoming centers, the dog and cat meat trade is a frequent outcome for many of these animals and is removing animals from their populations and undermining programs and activities which are in place to manage those populations. So now I just want to look at each country in a little more detail and expand on this issue of population dynamics, animal movements, and migration throughout the countries. So you can see here on the left, there's a map of Indonesia, and highlighted in red are the rabies endemic provinces, and in green are provinces which are historically rabies-free. What we've seen through our work with local partners and in cooperation with the Dog Meat Free Indonesia Coalition is that in many cases, animals are being caught and transported from rabies endemic provinces to rabies-free provinces to be killed and consumed. What you can see here on the right-hand side is the map of Java, and we've found that animals have been transported from Western Java to Central and Eastern Java across regency lines to be killed and consumed. Again, what we're looking at here is the high risk of animals which could have been exposed to rabies from these endemic provinces being transported to areas where rabies previously did not exist, and the movement of animals across these regency lines is very concerning and must be considered when we are looking at population management programs in these countries. Here we can see an image of a dog meat truck from Indonesia, something that would be commonly seen often in Indonesia. Dogs in particular are transported in sacks with their mouths tied shut. But to see large numbers of animals being transported throughout Indonesia in this manner is very common. So next, let's take a look at Vietnam. You can see on the left-hand side here, there is a map of the cat meat trade dynamics in Vietnam. Generally, cat meat consumption is higher in the north of the country And through our investigations, we have observed animals being brought in from China into northern Vietnam to be consumed in and around Tay Binh province, which is nicknamed the cat meat capital of Vietnam. The movement of animals across international borders, such as in from China, from Cambodia and Laos, other neighbor countries of Vietnam, poses a serious risk to rabies control in ASEAN countries. It was acknowledged by the World Health Organization as being a serious risk to rabies control throughout Southeast Asia. We can see here on the right-hand side a graphic map of the dog meat trade throughout Vietnam. Highlighted in red are the provinces with human rabies cases, and as we can see here, there is a high incidence of rabies throughout Vietnam. Then, as we observe animals being caught and transported generally from the south to the north of the country, moving across different provincial lines with little to no regulation or oversight, no understanding of the vaccination status of these animals. In investigations by the Asian Canine Protection Alliance in Hanoi, it was found that 4 out of 400 samples collected in dog meat slaughterhouses tested positive for rabies. And here we can see an image of a dog meat truck in Vietnam. This is something that you'll see regularly. Large numbers of animals are being driven on national highways across the country every day. So next we can have a look at Cambodia. And again, we can see here a map of the country and the distribution and demand hotspots. So to the northwest of the country, where you see these yellow icons, this is a border with Thailand, and there are lots of permeable forest borders along the northern edge of Cambodia into Thailand. And to the southeast, we can see there is a border here to Vietnam. And through our investigations, we've observed animals being transported across these international border lines. No understanding of the rabies situation or status of these animals. And this undermines rabies control efforts in all of the countries and puts both people and animals at risk. We can see that animals frequently are caught around the Siem Reap area in the northwest, then transported throughout Cambodia. While we are very pleased to report that Siem Reap became the first province in Cambodia to ban the dog and cat meat trade in 2020, it still means that there are a huge number of animals being killed in Cambodia and being caught, transported and traded throughout the country every year. Here we can see a photo of a typical vehicle in Cambodia which is used to transport dogs around the country. We often see that motorbikes with cages on the back are used to pick up dogs from rural communities, where dog meat traders will drive around with pots or pans, which are often traded for owned or community animals. The animals are then brought back to distribution points, where they are packed into cages and transported across the country, before ultimately ending up in slaughterhouses, where they are often beaten, stabbed, or drowned to death. It truly is terrible, and one of the most upsetting things I've seen in my career working in animal welfare. This is, again, why it's important for us to recognize the impact that this has on population management programs. If we consider a population management program which has been implemented in a province in any of these countries, and we consider the amount of animals that are being removed from those populations, it really has a damaging impact on the work that we are doing in trying to manage and maintain populations. I'll move on to the subject of rabies control in a moment, but even just understanding this from a population management or sterilization program perspective, it can be understood then that removing animals at this scale from these populations undermines our efforts to control these populations. It undermines the health and safety of these communities for both people and animals, and ultimately has a detrimental impact on the work and the outcomes that we'd be hoping to achieve to stabilize and maintain healthy and happy community animal populations. So given that, we also need to consider rabies control within the context of our arguments around the dog and cat meat trade. So here I'm sharing some information and studies around rabies and its connection to the dog and cat meat trade in Southeast Asia. In a 2007 outbreak in Ba Vi in Vietnam, 30% of those rabid cases during the outbreak were related to exposure during dog slaughtering. In Hanoi at the end of 2022, there were 2 reported deaths connected with people slaughtering dogs which were rabies positive. There have been rabies positive dogs found in restaurants, markets and slaughterhouses across China, Vietnam and Indonesia, and the Pasteur Institute in Cambodia found nearly 50% of the dogs they tested were identified as rabies positive. Again, it's really important to understand here that even a 1% prevalence of rabies is significant. We're talking about millions of dogs. In Vietnam, there are 5 million dogs, and even 1% would mean 50,000 rabid animals moving throughout the country and coming in close contact with people. On the right-hand side, there is a journal article that was released this year, which did a review of the risk factors and mortality of rabies incidences across Southeast Asia. And it specifically identified that, among other things, dog butchering and exposure to dog slaughter increases the risk of incidence of rabies within human populations, particularly in Vietnam, where this has been observed and measured numerous times. And therefore, we simply cannot ignore the dog and cat meat trade and its influence and impact on rabies control and rabies within these countries. As I mentioned before, when we're trying to maintain and manage animal populations, if large numbers of animals are being removed from those populations, irrespective of the risk that they might pose to the slaughterhouse traders and workers, we are undermining herd immunity by removing potentially vaccinated animals from those populations. We're undermining the efficacy and the impact of our programs, but we're also jeopardizing public safety and confidence by not being able to maintain healthy, vaccinated community animal populations. In a recent consultation meeting of the ASEAN Rabies Elimination Strategy, which was held in Bali, Indonesia in May this year, it was identified that, among other things, the potential role of the trade in dogs and cats for meat can be an influencing factor on the efficacy of rabies control programs. However, in presentations that were shared by the three countries which we're talking about, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, all of these countries cited similar major challenges in eliminating rabies in those countries. Lack of budget or resources, inadequate data, lack of community awareness, a difficulty in vaccinating dogs in rural areas, and limited collaboration between stakeholders. But the dog and cat meat trade was not mentioned as a cause for concern or even a major challenge in any of the presentations from those three countries. I must acknowledge here that in Cambodia there is a national rabies strategy currently being developed, which does include mention of the dog and cat meat trade, although this is still in a review stage. But I think it's again important to acknowledge the dog and cat meat trade and the role that this trade plays in rabies elimination strategies cannot be overlooked and must be considered when talking about One Health models for holistic rabies elimination and population management. The numbers are too great, the information is too strong, and the potential harm on our rabies control efforts is very clear and very apparent. So as I've mentioned, we believe it's important for countries with endemic rabies and dog and cat meat trade to consider the dog and cat meat trade in their rabies control efforts, and to consider the impact of the dog and cat meat trade on existing control programs and population management efforts. But now I'd just like to change the focus a little bit and look at other ethical consideration and problems which need to be considered when talking about dog and cat meat trade in Southeast Asia. So now let's think about what might happen after we achieve a ban on dog and cat meat trade. At Four Paws, we strongly pursue a ban on the dog and cat meat trade in all countries and in all forms, but we also need to consider the consequences of what might happen when we achieve that. There could potentially be tens of thousands of rescued animals which would need care, attention, and housing every year. There could potentially be population explosions in communities where animals are no longer being caught, killed, and removed, allowing them the opportunity to reproduce, especially when there are lacking CNVR capacity in many of these countries. There would likely be a black market trade, which would continue despite regulation, and this again would mean that rabies control and population management efforts continue to be undermined, and there is a potential that the rabies risk could increase as those populations expand. So here is a photo of some of the 61 dogs which were intercepted by Siem Reap authorities. They were in a minivan destined for slaughter, traveling from the Thai border side towards Siem Reap. And after being confiscated by the Siem Reap authorities, they contacted Four Paws to request help in taking care of these rescued dogs. We responded and coordinated with our local partners and local veterinary clinics to ensure that these dogs received medical care, and then were housed in a temporary adoption centre that was facilitated to provide care for these animals until loving forever homes could be found. The great news is that 50 of these dogs have been adopted out so far, and we're confident that the remaining 11 will find their own loving homes and be adopted very soon. This is such a great result for these dogs, and also really great that the Siem Reap authorities took the initiative to intercept and confiscate these dogs and to work together with us to provide a positive outcome for them, especially given the trauma that they went through having been caught and transported for the dog meat trade, destined to be killed and eaten. However, we need to consider the fact that this is not necessarily possible when talking about thousands or even tens of thousands of animals. In Southeast Asia, just like in many other parts of the world, shelters lack capacity and are not sustainable long-term solutions. We recognize that shelters do have their utility, but also that this is not feasible or sustainable as a long-term solution. Equally, when talking about adoptions are possible, but not immediate. And while adoption culture is growing throughout Southeast Asia, as I've just explained, shelters still remain overcrowded. And even after rescue, the animals would need to go somewhere to receive first aid care, medical attention before being adopted out. And again, this remains very challenging when talking about thousands or tens of thousands of animals. Many governments lack the infrastructure to accommodate and care for confiscated animals. And as we understand from our experience working in population management, the resources and lack of expertise within local government to deal with these stray animal problems is very common and very challenging. And while we work with governments to support initiatives, we need to recognize that it is very difficult to deal with such large numbers of animals. And even if they have been adopted or rehomed, if the dog and cat meat trade persists in these countries, there is a high risk of them being stolen and re-entering the trade once more. And then there are international adoptions, which have their utility when appropriate, but does not provide a sustainable solution to large numbers of animals in Southeast Asia or in any other countries to be adopted internationally. And then, sadly, we have to have the difficult but important conversation about euthanasia. Many governments have little to no capacity for humane euthanasia, and they have in the past resorted to very brutal methods such as burying them alive, burning, drowning. And often, as we've seen in Vietnam over the last few years, the animals which have been detained due to a lack of paperwork or the correct permits are often returned to the trader, who pays a negligible fine, and then continue to the slaughterhouse to meet the same terrible fate. We recognize, though, that, as I said before, governments don't have the capacity to deal with large numbers of confiscated animals, but we've also observed that the euthanasia techniques are inappropriate and often worse than some of the slaughter methods used. It's also important to recognize that NGOs and animal welfare groups are reluctant to euthanize large numbers of animals. And while it's proven that culling is never an effective means of population control, what we're talking about here are animals which have been stolen from their homes, often driven thousands of kilometers across countries, sometimes across international country lines, with no reliable source of origin and often limited viable solutions for them once intercepted or rescued. A conversation about euthanasia needs to be had, as difficult and as upsetting as that is. It's a necessary part of the conversation when considering solutions for the dog and cat meat trade. So I don't want to leave the presentation on such a sad note. And we have hope for the future, and we are hopeful that there are communities and people and groups around the world working hard to end the dog and cat meat trade and to find positive solutions and outcomes. And considering in a One Health model how the dog and cat meat trade, rabies control and population management work together in developing solutions and mechanisms which are effective, holistic and sustainable and ensure the best possible outcomes for people and animals and communities throughout Southeast Asia. And so with that, I want to thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your attention today. And if you do have questions or comments, please contact me. I'd really love to hear from you, hear any feedback you might have or any ideas you might have on the subjects discussed today. Thank you.